Welcome back, criminophiles, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit.
I'm Joseph Atkins, an American serial killer with 3 known victims.
Forensic and socio-legal analysis of the Joseph Atkins case, a study in intergenerational trauma, combat-induced psychopathology, and capital punishment.
The case of Joseph Atkins constitutes a significant chapter in the annals of South Carolina's criminal justice history, presenting a complex intersection of developmental trauma, military-related psychological deterioration, and the rigid application of capital statutes. Atkins, a Vietnam War veteran and a convicted triple murderer, provides a case study for forensic criminologists, legal historians, and psychiatric evaluators. His life, bookended by extreme domestic abuse and the finality of lethal injection in early 1999, illustrates a catastrophic closed loop of violence. This analysis examines the trajectory of Atkinson's life from his origins as an unwanted child through his 2 distinct periods of homicidal violence, culminating in a detailed review of the legal and psychiatric factors that defined his journey through the South Carolina Department of Corrections.
Developmental foundations and the scientific study of violence.
The etiology of Joseph Atkins' violent behavior is undeniably linked to a childhood characterized by profound instability and systematic physical abuse. Born in June 1947 to a sex worker who did not want him, Atkins was adopted by Benjamin Frank Atkins and Gladys Atkins in North Charleston, South Carolina. While adoption is frequently framed as a redemptive or stabilizing event, for Atkins, it marked the beginning of a lifelong exposure to brutality. The household into which he was placed was defined by a culture of physical dominance and fear, establishing an early blueprint for the resolution of conflict through violence. Benjamin Frank Atkins, the man who would eventually become one of his son's victims, was the primary architect of Joseph's developmental trauma. Joseph was frequently subjected to severe beatings and verbal tirades. Witnesses and subsequent reports indicate that Benjamin Atkins often utilized racist slurs against Joseph, likely due to the child's darker complexion, which stood in contrast to the rest of the family, a factor that introduced a dimension of identity-based psychological torment into the physical abuse. This racialized abuse, occurring within the supposed safety of the adoptive home, likely fostered a deep-seated sense of alienation and self-loathing. The domestic environment was further destabilized by the presence of an older half-brother, Charles Edward Atkins. Charles functioned as both a victimizer and a model of violent resolution. The interactions between the brothers were not merely sibling rivalries, but involved life-threatening assaults. On one occasion, Charles stabbed Joseph repeatedly in the stomach, an injury so severe that it required major surgery. On at least 3 other occasions, Charles inflicted head wounds on Joseph using various implements, including a rifle butt, a pulled cue, and a bottle. This level of psychological trauma, occurring during critical periods of brain development, likely contributed to a diminished capacity for impulse control and an increased predisposition towards aggressive responses to stress. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging element of Atkins' early life was the domestic violence he witnessed. He frequently saw his adoptive father brutalizing his mother Gladys in acts that included physical and carnal assault. Joseph believed that the chronic violence Gladys suffered specifically having her head repeatedly slammed against walls and floors by Benjamin, was the direct cause of the brain tumor that led to her death when Joseph was 15 years old. The loss of his mother, whom he viewed as a fellow victim of his father's rage, removed the only stabilizing influence in his life and cemented his resentment towards his father.
Military service and the Vietnam Crucible.
The psychological fragility established in Atkins' childhood was made worse by his induction into the United States Army during the Vietnam War. At approximately 21 years of age, Atkins was deployed to the border regions of Cambodia and Laos, areas known for high-intensity conflict and unconventional warfare. During his service, Atkins was exposed to the extreme end of the combat spectrum. Reports indicate he witnessed mutilations and the death of numerous civilians and combatants. More specifically, he was reportedly haunted by the memory of hearing fellow American soldiers who had been captured by enemy forces being tortured to death in the distance, a form of auditory trauma that often precipitates severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Despite the internal psychological toll, Atkins' outward performance as a soldier was decorated. Upon his return to the United States in October 1969, he was awarded several commendations for his service. However, the transition from a high-stress combat environment to the volatile domestic environment of North Charleston proved disastrous. Atkins returned home carrying the weight of both his childhood trauma and his recent wartime experiences. Within 3 months of his discharge, the combination of these stressors, often mediated by heavy alcohol consumption, would lead to his first homicide. The psychological impact of these awards is often paradoxical in forensic cases. While they indicate a level of discipline and social conformity within a structured environment, they also mark the individual as a trained instrument of state violence. For Atkins, the return to a civilian world where his training was no longer applicable, but his trauma remained active, created a volatile psychological state that the legal system in 1970 was ill-equipped to address.
The 1969 fratricide, the death of Charles Atkins.
On December 31st, 1969, just weeks after his return from Vietnam, Joseph Atkins attended a gathering at a friend's house with his half-brother Charles. The two, both of whom had been drinking, engaged in a violent altercation. In a sequence of events that mirrors a tactical response to domestic conflict, Joseph left the location, traveled several miles to his father's house to retrieve a shotgun, and returned to the scene of the fight. Atkins fired the shotgun, fatally wounding Charles and shooting out the windows of the residence. This act of fratricide was the culmination of the decade-long conflict between the two men. However, the subsequent legal proceedings introduced a critical procedural error that would later influence his 1980 death sentence. In March 1970, Atkins was indicted for homicide. Recognizing the history of mutual violence between the brothers and the mitigating circumstances of Atkins' recent return from war, the prosecution and defense reached a plea agreement for manslaughter. However, When Atkins appeared before the judge on May 28, 1970, he attempted to explain his actions by stating that Charles had reached back in his back pocket where he had his gun and that he fired because he was scared he was going to shoot. The presiding judge interpreted this statement as an assertion of self-defense. Legally, a judge cannot accept a guilty plea to a crime, in this case manslaughter, if the defendant maintains they acted in legally justifiable self-defense. Consequently, the plea deal was voided, and the case proceeded to trial. At trial, the jury rejected the self-defense claim, largely because Atkins had left the scene to retrieve a weapon and returned, which indicated premeditation rather than an immediate defensive reaction. He was found guilty of homicide and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970, though the jury recommended mercy. This conviction is significant not only for the decade of incarceration that followed, but because it served as the sole statutory aggravating factor that made Atkins eligible for the death penalty 16 years later.
Incarceration, parole, and the cycle of violence.
Atkins served approximately 10 years of his life sentence. During this period, a notable shift occurred in the family dynamic. Benjamin Atkins, the man who had systematically abused Joseph throughout his youth, became his son's primary advocate for release. Benjamin repeatedly petitioned the South Carolina Parole Board, pleading for his son to be granted another chance at civilian life. This advocacy is often seen in cases of intergenerational violence as a reparative attempt by the abuser to atone for earlier conduct, or perhaps as a manifestation of the complex trauma-bonded attachment between father and son. On March 14, 1980, Atkins was paroled. He returned to North Charleston to live in a duplex owned by his father. Joseph lived on one side of the structure while his father lived on the other. This arrangement placed the two men in constant proximity, essentially recreating the domestic environment that had been the site of so much historical trauma. The 5 years between 1980 and 1985 were characterized by Atkins' struggle to reintegrate. Although he held various jobs, he suffered from chronic alcoholism and likely undiagnosed PTSD. His social circle was limited, and his interactions with neighbors were sparse. In the spring of 1985, a family moved into a tenant house located behind the duplex. Aaron Polite, his common-law wife, Fatha Patterson, and their 13-year-old daughter, Karen Patterson. Tension existed between Atkins and the Patterson-Polite family. Testimonies revealed disputes regarding Atkins' behavior, including an incident where he flew a Confederate flag on Independence Day, which the neighbors interpreted as a racial provocation. While Atkins' defense would later argue that these were minor neighborly disputes, the prosecution framed them as evidence of a simmering hostility that would explode in October 1985.
The 1985 Duplex Massacre. Forensic Reconstruction.
The events of October 27, 1985, began after Joseph Atkins spent a night drinking with a neighbor, Arthur Henderson. During their interaction, Atkins reportedly made an ominous statement: "When I go home, anything I see in sight, I'm going to kill." At daybreak, Atkins returned to the duplex dressed in military fatigues and armed with an arsenal that included a machete, a .38 caliber revolver, and a sawed-off single-shot shotgun. The choice of attire and weaponry strongly suggests a dissociative return to his combat persona, a phenomenon indicative of a PTSD flashback where tactical behaviors are reenacted in a non-combat setting. Atkins' first act was to cut the phone lines to the duplex, demonstrating a high degree of tactical premeditation. Aaron Polite was awakened by noises outside and saw Atkins walking towards the duplex. When Father Patterson tried to call Benjamin Atkins for help, she discovered the lines were dead. As she left to walk to Benjamin's side of the duplex, Atkins entered the Polite Patterson residence.
The homicide of Karen Patterson.
Atkins proceeded to the bedroom of 13-year-old Karen Patterson. He fired a single shot from the sawed-off shotgun, striking the girl in the head at a range of 5 to 15 feet. Forensic evidence later showed that Karen had defensive wounds on her right hand, suggesting she had raised her hand in a futile attempt to shield herself from the blast. The single-shot nature of the weapon meant that Atkins had to manually unload the spent shell and reload a new one for every subsequent shot, a detail that the prosecution used to argue against claims of accidental firing.
The pursuit of Aaron Polite and Fatha Patterson.
As Aaron Polite emerged from his bedroom, he encountered Atkins standing in the hallway. Atkins leveled the shotgun at Polite, who managed to escape by jumping through a closed screen door. Atkins pursued him, firing multiple rounds as Polite fled into the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Father Patterson had reached Benjamin Atkins' door. As she prepared to enter, Joseph appeared and aimed a shotgun at her. She screamed and retreated. Benjamin Atkins, hearing the commotion, stepped to the door to investigate.
The homicide of Benjamin Frank Atkins.
Atkins fired the shotgun into his father's shoulder area. The blast caused massive hemorrhaging. Benjamin Atkins stumbled back into his home, collapsed, and bled to death within minutes. In a tragic irony, Benjamin died at the hands of the son whose life he had worked to save from the prison system just 5 years prior. As Father Patterson hid inside Benjamin's home and managed to reach a functioning phone line, she heard Atkins shouting through the walls. When she cried out for God's help, Atkins reportedly yelled back, "God can't help you now." Before fleeing on his motorcycle, Atkins fired several more rounds through the walls of the duplex and shot out the windows of his father's car.
Legal proceedings and judicial review.
The legal proceedings following the 1985 homicides were protracted and characterized by multiple appeals and a full resentencing phase. In January 1986, Atkins was indicted on 2 counts of homicide, 2 counts of assault with intent to kill, first-degree burglary, and 2 counts of unlawful possession of a weapon. During the June 1986 trial, the prosecution focused on the brutality of the killings and the helplessness of the victims. The primary aggravating factor that allowed for the pursuit of the death penalty was Atkins' 1970 homicide conviction. Under South Carolina law, a prior conviction for a crime of violence of this magnitude elevated a subsequent homicide to a capital offense. The defense team, which had limited experience in capital cases, focused on Atkins' intoxication and his history of alcoholism as mitigating factors. They failed, however, to raise the possibility of a guilty but mentally ill verdict, a statute that had been enacted in South Carolina in 1984. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before recommending the death penalty for both homicides. In 1987, the South Carolina Supreme Court affirmed Atkins' convictions but reversed the death sentence due to a technicality regarding the jury instructions. The case was remanded for a new sentencing hearing. The 1988 resentencing trial was essentially a repeat of the penalty phase. Atkins attempted to attack his 1970 conviction, arguing that it was a result of ineffective counsel. The court refused to allow this collateral attack, ruling that the resentencing hearing was not the appropriate forum to litigate a 20-year-old case. During this phase, the jury raised a critical question regarding parole eligibility. In 1988, South Carolina did not have a life without parole option for all capital cases. The jury asked the judge if they could sentence Atkins to consecutive life terms, which they believed would ensure he remained in prison for at least 40 years. The judge informed them that the decision of concurrent versus consecutive terms was his, and that Atkins would be eligible for parole in 20 years, regardless of the number of life terms. This instruction likely influenced the jury's decision to choose the death penalty as the only certain way to prevent Atkins' eventual release.
Psychiatric evaluations, and the combat veteran profile.
The case of Joseph Atkins is frequently cited in discussions regarding the Vietnam veteran defense. In the 1980s, the understanding of PTSD was evolving, and its application in criminal trials was often met with skepticism. The defense argued that Atkins' actions on the night of the homicides were indicative of a dissociative episode. The presence of military fatigues, the tactical cutting of phone lines, and the use of a shotgun were presented as learned behaviors from his time in combat. Forensic experts suggest that under the influence of alcohol, Atkins may have entered a state where he perceived his domestic environment as a combat zone. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Atkins' actions showed too much purposeful planning. The act of traveling to his father's house to retrieve the weapon in 1969 and the specific cutting of phone lines in 1985 suggested an organized mental state. The prosecution's experts argued that while Atkins may have suffered from psychological issues, he possessed a substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the law at the time of the offenses. Post-conviction appeals highlighted that the original psychological evaluations performed on Atkins were flawed. Experts who testified in 1986 later admitted they were not provided with the full details of his childhood abuse or the specifics of his military trauma. This information gap meant that the jury never received a comprehensive psychological profile that connected his childhood stabbings and head traumas to his adult violent outbursts. The legal system treated Atkins as a career criminal rather than a victim of chronic trauma whose behavior was a maladaptive response to his environment.
Analysis of weaponry and ballistics.
The choice of weapon in both the 1969 and 1985 incidents, a shotgun, provides significant insight into the nature of Atkins' violence. In 1969, he retrieved a standard shotgun to kill his brother. In 1985, he used a sawed-off single-shot shotgun. The modifications to the 1985 weapon, the sawing off of the barrel, indicates a clear intent to create a weapon that was easily concealable yet devastating at close range. Ballistic evidence from the 1985 scene showed that the shotgun was fired from a distance of 5 to 15 feet from Karen Patterson. The use of a single-shot mechanism meant that Atkins had to manually open the breech, extract the spent casing, and insert a fresh shell for every shot fired. This manual reload requirement is crucial in forensic psychology as it introduces a pause between each violent act. For Atkins to kill Karen, chase Aaron, and then kill Benjamin, he had to perform this mechanical task multiple times, which the prosecution argued evidenced a sustained and deliberate homicidal intent rather than a singular, uncontrolled impulse. The .38 caliber revolver found on his person at the time of arrest further suggests a state of combat readiness. Atkins was not merely a drunken man with a gun. He was an armed individual who had prepared multiple layers of weaponry to ensure lethality during his spree.
Socio-political implications and capital punishment.
The execution of Joseph Atkins must be viewed within the context of South Carolina's aggressive use of capital punishment in the late 1990s. When Atkins was executed in 1999, he was the 22nd person to be put to death since the state resumed executions in 1985. South Carolina was, at the time, one of the most active death penalty states in the nation. The case also intersected with the political climate of the late 1990s. Jim Hodges had recently taken office as governor of South Carolina in January 1999. One of his first major decisions was whether to grant clemency to Atkins. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations launched a significant campaign to stay the execution, citing Atkins' military service and the psychological mitigating factors. Governor Hodges reviewed a videotaped statement from Atkins as part of the clemency petition. In the video, Atkins expressed remorse, stating that he would gladly die if his death would bring back his two victims. Despite this expression of contrition, the governor denied clemency, citing the horrible conduct of the defendant and the innocence of the 13-year-old victim. Joseph Ernest Atkins was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina on January 23, 1999. In the death chamber, Atkins offered no final statement to the witnesses or the public. No relatives attended the execution, highlighting the total fragmentation of his family.
Criminological conclusions. The intergenerational loop.
The life and death of Joseph Atkins serve as a grim reminder of the long-term consequences of domestic violence and the untreated wounds of war. Atkins was not a serial killer in the traditional sense of a predatory stranger. He was a situational or domestic serial killer whose victims were exclusively those within his immediate social and familial circle. His case helped shape the legal discourse in South Carolina regarding parole eligibility instructions for the juries and the admissibility of psychological trauma in capital sentencing. The most profound insight from the Atkins case is the role of the father, Benjamin Atkins. Benjamin was both the architect of Joseph's early trauma and the primary advocate for his freedom. This creates a psychodependency where the victim is tethered to the abuser by both resentment and a desperate need for acceptance. The homicide of Benjamin in 1985 can be seen as the final violent rejection of this toxic dependency. The fact that Benjamin was killed while trying to help a neighbor, an act of altruism, contrasts sharply with his history as a domestic abuser, suggesting that both men were capable of extreme contradictions. Atkins' release in 1980 represents a failure of the risk assessment protocols of the era. The system failed to account for the fact that paroling a violent offender back into the exact environment where his original trauma occurred was a recipe for recidivism. Furthermore, the lack of mandatory PTSD counseling for paroled veterans in the 1980s meant that Atkins was essentially left to self-medicate his trauma with alcohol, which led to the 1985 explosion. The case remains a definitive study in the necessity of integrated mental health and judicial interventions for individuals caught in the crosshairs of developmental abuse and military trauma. The Joseph Atkins case underscores limitations of the legal system in addressing the complexity of human trauma. While the state sought justice for the victims, it struggled to navigate the mitigating circumstances that defined the perpetrator's life. The result was a judicial process that satisfied the requirements of the law, but left broader questions about the prevention of such intergenerational tragedies unanswered. The case remains a critical reference point for understanding the impact of environmental and psychological factors on criminal behavior. The case of Joseph Atkins is a profound testament to the ripple effect of trauma. The violence Benjamin Atkins inflicted in the 1950s echoed through the decades, resulting in the deaths of Charles in 1969, Karen and Benjamin in 1985, and Joseph himself in 1999. It remains an essential study in the need for trauma-informed judicial systems that can identify and intervene in the cycle of violence before it reaches its terminal conclusion.
That ends my story. A life consumed by violence.
That ends another episode of Homicide Cases as I close the file on Joseph Atkins. Join me next time where I'll be opening the file on Johnny Avalos. If you or somebody you know or love is a victim of domestic violence, get them help right away.
Thanks for watching. If this is your type of content, then please give me a like and follow. It'll help me keep this series going. This is Misfit signing off, and as always, stay safe.